Chapter 3572. She looked at her father's back as he cooked and felt that he had changed. In the past her father was so high-spirited. So many people looked up to him. But now it was different. His back looked so lonely. Bai Shuali's eyes were hot. She felt a little sour and wanted to cry. But after so long her tears had all dried up. During the meal she almost didn't dare to look at her father. She was afraid of his penetrating gaze. After the meal Mr. Bai coaxed Mrs. Bai to sleep. Then he went downstairs and saw Bai Shuali leaning on the railing looking at him silently. He looked at his daughter quietly. After a while he walked over and handed her a cup of hot food. "What are you looking at?" Bai Shuali took the hot food and looked at her father. She said in a low voice, "I'm looking at the night view. I'm thinking that if everything returned to the past maybe I wouldn't have married into the Yi family." She paused, her eyes watery. "Dad, I hurt you. It's just a matter of time, Shuali. This has nothing to do with you." Mr. Bai sat beside his daughter and looked at the boundless night with her. He sighed. "It's just brought forward. But Shuali, it's because of Yi Mulan that your father's sentence was reduced by so many years. You might not know that if you want to step on someone, it's best to kill them in prison. 5 years is really a gift." He looked at his daughter. Bai Shuali looked at him in shock. Mr. Bai smiled faintly. "Even this time he took the risk to come forward. Otherwise how would I be able to come out?" He smiled bitterly and reached out to touch Bai Shuali's head. "Dad doesn't object to you being with him. The man loves you. But you have to think about whether you want to sacrifice yourself for Mom and Dad. His father is not a soft-hearted person." Bai Shuali was silent for a moment. "It's probably karma. Yi Xinggang got divorced. Yi Mulan's mother is now with Hao Yun." Mr. Bai was a little surprised. He looked at his daughter and did not speak for a long time. Bai Shuali told him about Xie Anning. Mr. Bai laughed coldly. In the end he fell into the hands of a woman. Su Fu was such a good woman, yet he let her down. When he said this, Mr. White's face looked a little bleak. It was as if he had received a lot of information. Bai Shuali stared blankly at her father. Mr. Bai smiled and said, "Su Fu was recognized as the national goddess. Everyone liked her. Your father was still a loser in the early days. He could only look at her from afar. Surely you can't tell your mother about this." Bai Shuali laughed and said, "Dad, you even have this part?" Mr. Bai smoked a cigarette and said faintly, "What hasn't your father experienced? Life is full of ups and downs. Ups and downs are no big deal. After I come out I don't have much to hope for. I'll just rely on your mother and find a job to support her. I owe her a lot. I'll make it up to her in the future." Chapter 3573. Bai Shuali nodded in agreement. Mr. Bai said a lot more because he didn't know when they would meet again. He talked until the middle of the night. She said she was sleepy and she wanted her father to stay with her mother. Late at night Mr. Bai stood in the luxurious living room for a long time before he said, "When I come out let's move to another house. It's too big and not practical." Bai Shuali nodded in agreement. "Let's move to another level." She was sobbing as she said, "Dad, you have to come back in one piece, okay? Mom and I will be waiting for you." Mr. Bai touched his daughter's hair and nodded in agreement. He turned and walked upstairs. Although they were resting, who could sleep? After a short night, the family of 3 was destined to go their separate ways again. It was a sleepless night until the sound of firecrackers was heard. Bai Shuali seemed to have heard the noise downstairs. She immediately got up, put on a coat and ran downstairs. There were 2 black cars parked at the entrance. Mrs. Bai was already in one of them and Mr. Bai was about to get in. Bai Shuali stood on the stairs and called out to her father. Mr. White turned around and looked at her. He gave her a small smile. "Surely." Bai Shuali's face was pale and she called out to her father. Then she rushed over and hugged Mr. Bai. "Dad." Mr. Bai lowered his head and said softly, "It's only 3 years. Shuali, don't be sad and don't ask him for anything. It's dangerous, okay?" He knew. She looked up and nodded, but she couldn't help but feel sad. Mr. Bai comforted her. He had been a leader before and wasn't as weak as Bai Shuali. But he still left. When he closed the car door he couldn't bear it. It was his fault that he couldn't protect his wife and child. The 2 cars started slowly and went their separate ways. Bai Shuali stood at the entrance of the Bai residence and watched. Her tears were about to fall but she held them back. She returned to the living room. Mr. Bai had prepared breakfast for her. It was still warm. There was a pair of handmade slippers on the sofa. It should have been made by her mother. She finished her breakfast quietly and held the slippers in her hands. She didn't stay in the villa for long and left. It was the first day of the new year. There were still firecrackers everywhere, but she was facing a farewell. Suddenly she missed Yi Mulin very much. She wanted to see him. She took out her phone and dialed his number, but the sound of the phone being turned off came from the other end. She was stunned for a long time and did not come back to her senses. After a long time she slowly walked forward. A taxi stopped in front of her and asked if she wanted a ride. She sobered up and thought for a moment before smiling. Okay. She sat in the car and the driver asked the young lady where she was going. She should go to the apartment, but she didn't want to. In the end she said, "I'll just walk around B City." Bai Shuali said blankly. The driver agreed and started to drive around. It was the new year and B City was deserted in the morning. Bai Shuali sat in the car and watched quietly until her eyes felt a little sore. She then gave the driver an address, but she was absent-minded and told him the address of the Yi family's old mansion. Chapter 3574. The driver worked very hard to pull her over. When they arrived, Bai Shuali paid the driver without even looking. The driver drove the car away as soon as he saw Xian. However, when she got out of the car, she realized that the place she got out of the car was the Yi family's old house. The Hui-style building was very grand, and it looked very imposing in the cold morning of B City. She looked at it quietly as if a lifetime had passed. She stood there motionless. She stood there silently for a long time. There were her best and worst memories. She turned her head and a black motorhome stopped behind her silently. In the car, Yi Mulin sat quietly and Wen Yuan was beside him. Bai Shuali looked into his eyes. Their eyes were glued to each other and her heart twitched. In the car, Yi Mulin's hands were holding the steering wheel very tightly. He looked at Bai Shuali quietly. Wen Yuan, who was beside him, looked at Bai Shuali and then looked at the man beside him. He asked softly, "Do you want to get out of the car to meet her?" In front of their car was Wen Yuan's father's car. Wen Yuan was considerate, but he couldn't accept this kindness. He said calmly, "No need." As he said that, he pressed the button, and the majestic black door of the Yi family's house opened immediately. Yi Mulin's car slowly slid in and he passed by Bai Shuali. When he passed by her, he saw the tears in the corner of her eyes and saw how lonely she looked. This was originally her home, but now she was standing there like a stranger. "But Shuali, you don't know that this is not my home anymore." Yi Mulin closed his eyes and Wen Yuan put his hand on the back of his hand. He smiled gently. "Coax her later." Yi Mulin's voice was a little depressed. "Wen Yuan, are you tired?" He didn't slap her hand away, but his expression was distant. He stopped the car and said quietly, "A marriage that looks united but is actually divided is not good. Wen Yuan, are you sure you want to do this?" Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. "It's all for the clan, isn't it?" She looked at Bai Shuali through the rearview mirror and smiled. "I envy her. She is willful no matter what, but she has always been able to live a good life. Mulin, we are the same kind of people, but she doesn't belong to our world. You can take care of her and pamper her. I don't mind, but I won't ruin your relationship. If these things can make you happier, I am willing to indulge you." He tilted his head and looked at Wen Yuan. "Shuali is the same type of person as my mother. I've heard a statistic that men will instinctively like women who are the same type as their mother. I don't know if this is true, but it seems like Mu Bai is the same." At the mention of Yi Mu Bai, Wen Yuan's expression changed slightly. Yi Mulin's gaze deepened. He leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "You really don't want to consider Mu Bai? Are you sure you like a boring person like me? Mu Bai knows a lot and he might be able to stir up your calm heart." Under his words, Wen Yuan was flustered. She opened the car door and got out. After getting out of the car, her heart was heaving up and down. She kept adjusting her breathing, telling herself that it must be her imagination. Yi Mulin definitely wouldn't know that she and Yi Mu Bai slept together after drinking. Yi Mu Bai, that bastard, said that he wouldn't tell anyone and said that they would part ways. Yi Mulin got out of the car. When he got out, he looked outside. Bai Shuali was already gone. Chapter 3575. Wen Yuan looked at Yi Mu Bai's poker face. He was sure that he didn't know. As for Yi Mu Bai, she could only say sorry. That night was an accident. Since it was an accident, it was fine to stop there. She couldn't continue to make mistakes with him, so she had been avoiding him these days. However, she didn't expect that today's gathering was not only attended by the parents of both sides, but also by Yi Mubai. Wasn't he abroad? Why did he come back? When Yuan's gaze was a little uncomfortable, and his hand holding Yi Mulan's tightened. Yi Mulan asked calmly, "What's wrong?" When Yuan forced a smile, "Nothing." At this time Yi Mubai walked over. When Yuan immediately let go of Yi Mulan's hand, "I'll go talk to Auntie for a while." Because it was a marriage event, Su Fu also came, but not as Yi Xinggang's wife, but as Yi Mulan's mother. Yi Mulan watched her leave and then turned to look at his brother. "Why are you back?" Yi Mubai smiled faintly. "We're back for a family reunion, but it seems that one person is missing." He walked to the bar, poured a glass of wine for himself and Yi Mulan, and then walked to the balcony with Yi Mulan. Yi Mubai looked at his brother with an unfriendly expression. "Did you put the drug on us that night?" Yi Mulan squinted, smiled, and took a sip of wine. "What drug? Who is we?" Yi Mubai stared at him and wanted to grab his collar. "Don't pretend to be innocent. You don't know?" "You mean when I was sick, when Yuan saw Shueli complaining to you and you slept with her?" Yi Mulan patted his brother's shoulder and said earnestly and lovingly, "I asked you to comfort her, not to sleep with her. Mubai is my future wife after all. Can you restrain yourself a little? It won't look good if it gets out." Yi Mubai was furious. Why? Why did he have to sleep with someone his brother didn't want to marry? He said coldly, "I don't believe you will marry her." Yi Mulan smiled. "Since you knew, why did you still sleep with her?" His meaning was too obvious. Yi Mubai's face darkened. "Yi Mulan, I find that you're becoming more and more black-bellied." Yi Mulan patted his shoulder. "For the family, I sacrificed myself for you once. Shouldn't it be your turn now?" Then he smiled and walked towards the head of the Wen family. He looked like he was preparing a son-in-law. Yi Mubai spat out angrily. Did these fools really expect Yi Mulan to marry Wen Yuan? He was merely stalling for time. Wen Yuan was merely a springboard for him to jump to be city. Wen Yuan was foolish and the Wen family was even more foolish. But the biggest idiot was him, Yi Mubai. He knew it clearly, but he still fell for it. When he thought about Wen Yuan's lukewarm expression, his scalp went numb. He was the perfect wife, but not the one he wanted. The Yi family seemed to be in a harmonious mood. But everyone had their own thoughts. The Wen family had lunch here and then left. Yi Mulan sent Wen Yuan away, and Su Fu was also going to leave. She contacted Hao Yun, and Hao Yun said that he would be back in half an hour, so she waited in the living room downstairs. Yi Xingang walked over and put a cup of scented tea in front of her. "He hasn't come yet?" Su Fu nodded. "There's a little traffic jam on the road." She looked at the scented tea, which was the kind she used to like to drink, so she smiled. "Thank you." Chapter 3576. However, Yi Xiaolong didn't show it because that would make him look too lowly. He sat beside her and asked casually, "Does he treat you well?" Su Fu froze for a moment, probably not expecting him to ask such a question. She smiled. "Not bad." Yi Xingang wanted to say something more, but Su Fu said softly, "I got my marriage certificate with him." Then Yi Xingang went silent for a long time. His face was indescribably gloomy, as though every frown on his face was filled with disappointment. After a long time he sighed. "Su Fu, you're not giving me any chance at all." Su Fu was much calmer now. She said softly, "Don't be like that. I can't be with him without any status. I'm already so old, so I have to be decent." Yi Xingang had just recovered from the shock, so he asked, "What about his family? Do they treat you well?" "They're all pretty good," Su Fu smiled. "Because of my status, I can't do much. Just having a meal with my family is good enough." Yi Xingang lowered his eyes and didn't say anything for a long time. Later on, Hao Yun came over. He and Yi Xingang almost didn't contact each other anymore. Some things were handled by Secretary Li. When Yi Xingang looked at Hao Yun again, it was as though a lifetime had passed and there was an indescribable feeling in his heart. He watched as Hao Yun held Su Fu's waist and got into the car. He was especially considerate. He thought that she must be happy to be loved by someone wholeheartedly. Suddenly he called out to her. "Su Fu, wait up." Su Fu sat in the car and rolled down the window to look at him. Yi Xingang turned around and went to the study room. He took out a set of precious mahogany screens for her. It was carved by a master and had a high collection value. Sufu had always liked it. He placed it in her hand and smiled. Live a good life from now on. His eyes were fixed on her as he said this. She was still that beautiful woman, but he was no longer that high-spirited Yi Xinggang. Sufu smiled. Thank you. Hao Yun nodded at Yi Xinggang, walked around, opened the door and started the car. In fact, Hao Yun knew very well that Yi Xinggang would let him go because he still loved Sufu. However, that kind of love after being crippled was hard to come back. A woman like Sufu was, after all, proud and unwilling to compromise. In the car, Sufu looked at the small screen and put it down. Put it in your study later. Hao Yun smiled gently. Don't mind me as long as you like it. Oh. Sufu sighed. I don't like it so much now. It's true that I like reading, but... She suddenly tilted her head and looked at Hao Yun. Because you like me like this. For her sudden confession, Hao Yun's ears were a little hot and red. He held her hand and said softly, save these words for me when we get home, okay? She smiled slightly and looked out of the car window. The New Year's firecrackers had been going off all the time, indicating the arrival of a new year and the beginning of everything. She sighed faintly. I always feel that I'm sorry for your parents if I can't have a child. Hao Yun was the only son. His parents were old professors at Tsinghua University. They came from a famous family. It was a little unfair for him to marry her and then he didn't have a child. She was still worried. Hao Yun held her hand. Don't force it. It's always in your life. Chapter 3577. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when Yi Mulan dropped Wen Yuan off. As he drove, he took out his phone and dialed Bai Shuali's number. The call went through and he asked in a deep voice, "Where are you?" Then he asked, "Have you eaten?" She seemed to be stunned for a moment and then she said softly, "I have." Yi Mulan wanted to talk to her. He really wanted to talk to her now, so he asked her softly, "Where are you now? I'll come to pick you up." Bai Shuali stood on the street, looked at the shops on the street and said softly, "I'm shopping." His facial expression softened a little and he lowered his voice. "Where are you? I'll come to pick you up." She took a breath and her voice was a little hoarse. "Don't you need to accompany Wen Yuan?" He froze for a moment and he held the phone for a long time without saying anything. Silence spread between them. After a long time he said in a hoarse voice, "Shuali?" She was sad but she still told him her address and waited for him there. When Yi Mulan drove over, Bai Shuali was sitting in a cafe on the street. It was the new year but the cafe was still very full. He parked the car and sat in the car and he saw his Shuali sitting by the window looking over in a daze. He rolled down the window and smiled at her. Bai Shuali sat there and looked into his eyes. She saw warmth in his eyes. After a long time she also smiled lightly. Yi Mulan opened the car door, closed the door and walked towards her. Bai Shuali called the waiter and ordered a cup of Montaigne for him. Then she watched him take off his coat and sit across from her. He looked at the simple meal in front of her and he tapped the table with his hand. "Is this the meal you were talking about?" "Oh." She drank the coffee and her eyes were a little round. "I ate vinegar for lunch." Yi Mulan didn't expect her to say this. He was stunned for a moment and then he smiled. Then he bent his finger and gently knocked her head. "You're getting better at talking. Will you marry her?" She opened her eyes wide and she looked at him innocently. At this time the waiter brought Yi Mulan's coffee. He took a sip, then looked into her eyes and said very slowly, "If I say yes, will you leave me?" "I think so." She looked down and said in a low voice, "What else can I do?" She said, raising her eyes to his. Yi Mulan reached out and rubbed her hair. He smiled and said, "I won't." She wanted to ask what he meant, but her pride stopped her. Instead she smiled and said, "By the way, thank you for last night." Yi Mulan didn't say anything. He just drank his coffee and looked at her warmly. Outside the transparent window it was snowing and his smile was very warm. At this moment she no longer complained that he had become like her father because she liked this warmth. At this moment she also knew that regardless of whether he would marry Wen Yuan or not, the person he loved was her, Bai Shuali. "Yi Mulan." She called his name softly. "Let's go see the snow together." She held her face in her hands. It hasn't snowed in B City since we got married. Actually, this was the first time they had spent the new year together since they got married, But they were already divorced, he agreed. When they walked out of the cafe, he held her hand and helped her put on the scarf. They walked into the gentle snow together. Chapter 3578. The gentle snow drifted on his shoulders, hair and eyebrows. After walking for a long time, his entire body was covered with a layer of snow. Bai Shuali looked at Yi Mulin and smiled. Yi Mulin, you seem to be Santa Claus. Yi Mulin chuckled, turned his body and gently pushed her hair away. Bai Shuali, your hair is also white. If we continue to walk like this, we can be considered to have walked until our hair turns white. She didn't expect him to say this. She smiled lightly and reached out to wipe the snow on his eyebrows. You too. He gazed at her, his hands slid down to hold her waist and he leaned over to kiss her lightly. On the streets of B City. She was a little scared and didn't know what to do. Yi Mulin, we will be seen. Then just wait and see. He pressed his forehead against hers, his warm breath on her lips. Surely sometimes I also feel tired and want to give up. I want to just let it go, but I still can't. He didn't say too much, he just told her about his dilemma. Bai Shuali wanted to step back, but he didn't let her. He just hugged her tightly. In the gentle snow in the vast world, he kept hugging her. And the scene of them hugging was taken, but they didn't realize it at all. Because they had stayed outside for too long, their bodies were covered in snow, which melted when they got in the car, so they took off their coats. Bai Shuali took out a paper bag from the side and gave it to him. New Year's gift. Yi Mulin looked at her, a little surprised. Then he took the bag and opened it. It was an LV scarf, the color was low-key and reserved. I like it very much. He smiled, then looked at her. Is this a gift or a thank you? Is it different? She looked at him, her eyes a little watery. He pinched her face and smiled. There is a difference. A gift is a gift and a thank you is a thank you. But for your thank you, use something else. He looked at her meaningfully, stretched and said, It's very busy before the new year and I have to work on the third day of the new year. This was a typical old man's purpose of gaining sympathy in exchange for shameless looks. Bai Shuali didn't understand it before. She was such an innocent little girl, but now she understood. She stared at him. You're just taking advantage of me. Well, he admitted, I'm a normal man. He started the car and drove towards the direction of the apartment. Bai Shuali bit her lip and looked at him. To her surprise, after returning to the apartment, he didn't immediately ask her to do anything. Instead, he asked her to change her clothes and went to the kitchen. Bai Shuali went into the bedroom, which was exactly the same as before. Some of her clothes were still there and she even added some winter clothes. She held the tag and looked at him in surprise. She looked at him. And suddenly, Bai Shuali tilted her head and looked in his direction. Her eyes were misty. After a long time, she pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She changed her clothes and walked out. Yi Mulin was preparing dinner. Hearing her footsteps, he said softly, Let's celebrate the new year too. Bai Shuali hugged him from behind and said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, why did you divorce me back then? His body froze and he lowered his head, his voice a little hoarse. Shuali. He sniffed. I want to know, Yi Mulin. I want to know. Chapter 3579. As she spoke, she was a little emotional. She hugged him tightly with her fingers. Yi Mulin held her hand, his gaze landing on their entwined hands. He smiled faintly. Shuali, do you think we're divorced? As he said that, he dragged her in front of him, his fingers caressing her face gently. Bai Shuali was slightly stunned. Looking into his eyes, she stammered, We don't. He shook his head. No, not in my heart. As he said that, he lowered his head and kissed her gently. It was the kind that was not in a hurry to possess her, as though he had a lifetime to spend with her. Bai Shuali raised her head. It was a little strenuous because he was too tall and she was only wearing indoor slippers. After a long time, he finally loosened his grip a little. She complained softly, You're too tall. His gaze flickered and his voice became hoarse. You didn't complain about the size at the critical moment. Her face blushed. Biting her lips, she retorted helplessly, What size? Yi Mulin bit her lips. You clearly knew, but you still pretended not to know. With that said, he carried her to the small dining table and sat her down. Rest for a while. Then he stuffed a cup of hot fruit tea into her hands. Bai Shuali looked at his back view. Black trousers paired with a gray sweater easily made him look classy. When he was a lawyer, he always gave off a domineering vibe. Now that he was more in touch with the people, she always felt that he was like an elder. He was not used to it. She lowered her eyes. If he was doing this for her, did he like this job? Bai Shuali suddenly felt like walking into Yi Mulan's world. She seemed to be enjoying his kindness, enjoying his care, and perhaps even sacrificing herself. She did not even dare to think too deeply about it. Because her father said that with his character, it was unlikely that he would not end up in jail. Then Yi Shingang was not willing to let him go because of their old relationship. It was most likely because he had reached an agreement with Yi Mulan. Bai Shuali looked at him quietly and suddenly felt that she was very useless. She kept complaining that if she didn't marry him, she wouldn't have been so sad and wouldn't have lost a child. However, she had never thought that he was more sad than she was. He lost his marriage and child, and his family betrayed him. He was also under pressure. Her heart beat faster. Did he do all of this for her? Yi Mulan was still chopping vegetables. He was very serious. She was unable to restrain the agitation in her heart. She walked over and gently hugged him. "Surely," he said helplessly, "if you keep acting like this, we won't have food to eat." She buried her face in his back and said in a low voice, "Yi Mulan, I just want to feel your warmth." His hand paused for a moment and he turned to look at her. "Do you want to feel it deeply?" As he spoke, he was about to put down the knife, wanting to have intimate contact with her. Bai Shuali closed her eyes in disgust and shrieked, "No." He pinched her waist and chuckled. "Who was the one who teased me just now?" She was still smiling as she bit her lip. "You're chopping vegetables. It smells bad." Chapter 3580. Not only did he ask, but he also stared at her with a burning gaze. She lowered her face uncomfortably and looked at him. She asked softly, "Do you really want to?" He nodded, kissed her and continued to cook. She hugged him from behind again, looking very dependent. Yi Mulan only smiled lightly and didn't say anything. He made a table full of delicious dishes and Bai Shuali ate until her stomach was round. She couldn't stop praising him as she ate. "You're really good at both the dining hall and the kitchen. What about in bed?" Yi Mulan looked at her and asked slowly. She stammered, "How can I talk like that?" He smiled and lit a cigarette. "That's the most important thing, okay? If I don't cook well, I can hire someone to cook for me. If I don't do well in making love, do you think I can hire someone to replace me?" Bai Shuali glared at him. "It's a pity that you're not continuing to be a lawyer, Yi Mulan." After saying that, she noticed a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Her red lips trembled slightly and her voice was hoarse. "Yi Mulan, I didn't do it on purpose." Amidst this disappointment, she finally knew that his favorite job was to be a lawyer, not to have power and influence. And he could sacrifice everything else for her, apart from his interests and ideals. For a moment she didn't know what to say. She was afraid that she would say something wrong. Yi Mulan was stunned for a moment before he regained his composure. He reached out and caressed her head. "Bai Shuali, all jobs are fun. It's not what you think it is, okay?" He said in a low voice. Then he looked at the cups and plates on the table and moved his chin at her. "Run the bathwater for me. I'll take a bath after I'm done." She replied with an "oh," but her gaze was still fixed on him. He looked at her. "You want me to take a bath now? Together?" She ran away immediately. After she left, Yi Mulan's eyes immediately became a little dazed. He stared at her for a long time before he finally cleared the table. He put the dishes in the sink but didn't wash them immediately. Instead, he lit a cigarette and stood there smoking. It wasn't that he didn't feel anything. He really liked being a lawyer. It was addictive. He loved the feeling of standing in court. He loved the feeling of fighting against the opposing counsel. It was a great thrill. And now he had to put on his mask and smile kindly and be called Mr. Knight, and he had to be gentle like a different person. He didn't like this, but he didn't want to lose Bai Shuali even more. Yi Mulan exhaled a long smoke ring. He was afraid that she would find out, so he put out the cigarette before he finished smoking. After washing the dishes, he washed his hands twice before walking towards the bathroom in the master bedroom. Bai Shuali was still running the water. The water was about to overflow, but she was still in a daze. Yi Mulan walked over, picked her up and threw her into the bathtub. She screamed, "Yi Mulan." She popped her head out and was a little angry. He was too hateful. Her clothes were all new and he had ruined them just like that. Yi Mulin chuckled and said lazily, "Didn't you just say that you want me to do that?" He stood in front of her and started to take off his sweater. Bai Shuali screamed and covered her eyes. "What are you doing? Don't take it off." There was a doting expression on his face. "Some people think that I'm like an old grandpa now. Then should I be more savage?" Chapter 3581. Bai Shuali's clothes were fine, but they were soaked in water as he carried her in his arms. And he was so clean. She wasn't used to it. She struggled and said softly, "Yi Mulin, can you let go of me first?" He stared at her little face and said hoarsely, "No." With that said, he kissed her. "Tell me, do you still think you're like your father?" His thin lips moved to the back of her ear and kissed. "Can your father give you this feeling?" She couldn't stand his lewd kisses and turned her face away. "Don't say any more." He smiled. "I thought we needed to make things clear." She hooked her arms around his neck and kissed his chin. "Don't you want to do that? Why do you keep saying these things?" Yi Mulin's thin lips moved over and kissed her lips. After that, there was only the sound of kissing. He carried her out and kissed her against the bathroom wall. He even turned on the shower and the hot water warmed the wall. It was very comfortable. Bai Shuali was a little uneasy. She struggled and said in a low voice, "Yi Mulin, don't torture me like this." He kissed her and his voice was filled with boundless desire. Because of this, he became especially fierce. "I love you." He stopped kissing her and nibbled on the corner of her mouth. "Shuali, I love you." She wanted to say something, but she frowned and started crying softly. She hit his shoulder with her little hands and cried, "Yi Mulin, let go of me. It hurts. I don't want it anymore." He should feel heartache when she was in pain. But he wanted her to remember this feeling, to remember that his love could be sweet and painful. He wanted her to feel his pain. On the first day of the new year, Bai Shuali was tortured badly. He kept begging for mercy. His heart ached, but he still enjoyed it. Just like when they were newlyweds, he liked to play rough. Finally, everything calmed down. She lay on the bed, still sobbing. Her fair face was buried in the pillow, and her eyelids were slightly swollen from crying. Her long eyelashes trembled, and there were even 2 drops of crystal-clear tears on them. Yi Mulin leaned over and kissed her eyelids. "Are you uncomfortable?" Her face was buried in the quilt and her voice was nasal. He was still angry. "Go away." He chuckled. "Do you really want me to go away?" As he spoke, he pinched her soft cheeks. "Are you really willing to do that?" He was already fully dressed, but she was still lying there in a mess. She looked extremely disheveled. She did not have the strength to get dressed or take a bath. She knew very well that he still had such a bad taste at this moment. She gritted her teeth and glared at him. "Yi Mulin, you're too despicable." Laughing, he sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her body into his arms, covering her body with the thin quilt. His voice was hoarse. "Can I rub it for you?" "No." Her voice was filled with grievance. "Yi Mulin, don't touch me. Do you hear me? Don't touch me anymore." He chuckled, but he still touched the place where she had endured him. He rubbed it gently and his voice was very gentle. "Does it still hurt?" She was originally a little angry because he was too bad. But now that she was lying in his arms and he was so gentle, her anger dissipated. Her voice was low and hoarse. "Much better." Chapter 3582. As soon as she finished speaking, the gentle hand that was massaging her changed its tone. She screamed, "Yi Mulin, what are you doing?" Her voice trembled uncontrollably. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against hers. "How many times do I have to do it before I'm different from your father, She hugged him like a rascal. "No more." She lay flat on his lower abdomen like a little baby. "Yi Mulin, Daddy, don't." He chuckled. His heart was so warm that he didn't know what to do with her. He wanted to crush her, but he didn't want to. He didn't feel satisfied if he didn't do anything. In the end, he just hugged her and kissed her ear. "Shili, just stay by my side. Don't worry about anything. Do you hear me?" Her heart was trembling, but she forced a smile. "You're so bossy again." He smiled warmly and then lowered his head. "It doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't hurt anymore. Let's continue." The way she looked at him was infuriating. Yi Mulin chuckled. He held her chin and kissed her. Outside the window there were a few electronic fireworks, dazzling the night sky amidst the gentle snow. On the second day of the Chinese New Year, Yi Mulin was going out. Although he didn't say anything, Bai Shuali knew that he was going to see Wen Yuan. Perhaps he was going to visit the Wen family. The relationship between him and Wen Yuan had been going on under the push of the elders. Although he had promised her that he would always be with her and give all his feelings and flesh to her. But after going through so much, Bai Shuali wasn't the same as before. In the past they could be together as long as they liked each other. When they still had a marriage it was so good. But it was broken up. She held a cup of milk tea in her hands and smiled softly. It was a helpless smile. She ate the breakfast that he made for her and walked down the street. Yi Mulin said that they were going back to H City tonight, so she decided to go home at 4 o'clock. Early in the morning the snow from yesterday had melted. However, the air was cold and dry, making the street seem even emptier. She walked around casually. A familiar person walked out of a shop and greeted her. Bai Shuali. Bai Shuali remembered that it was Ma Chunhua. She used to be her classmate. She had fought with Yi Mulin because of her. "What's the matter?" she asked softly. Ma Chunhua smiled reservedly. "It's nothing, I'm just concerned about you. I heard that something happened to your family and you're divorced. Later I heard that you're looking for work everywhere for money, and the place you're working at is a little dirty." Bai Shuali, who was waiting to see her make a fool of herself, replied nonchalantly, "Yes, but I found an old man to carry it for me. He treats me pretty well. But he bought this bag for me. It's more than $1 million. Ma Chunhua's expression was a little ugly. Her disdain was mixed with some envy and jealousy. Bai Shuali seemed to have thought of something again. "If you want, I can also introduce an old man to you. He's very generous. In the future you won't have to work so hard to come to such a place to spend money. Let me tell you, eating in these places is not hygienic. You will get sick." Ma Chunhua's face turned white and then red. She blurted out, "I think you're the one who's going to get sick. You're going to get AIDS, right?" "Yes, but you have to be careful of your husband at that time. Some men can't resist the temptation of beautiful women," Bai Shuali said with ill intentions. Then she looked at the gigolo husband of the woman surnamed Ma. Chapter 3583. Bai Shuali looked at their backs and pursed her lips. Just as she was about to leave, a woman stood in front of her. It was the familiar yet strange Ai Wei. Ai Wei was wearing a European-style coat and looked tall and sexy. She flipped her hair and said, "Let's talk." Bai Shuali walked forward slowly and said, "What do we have to talk about? If it's for a man you should talk to Wen Yuan." Ai Wei grabbed her arm and said nervously, "Wen Yuan has never been in Yi Mulin's love life. You know it better than me." Bai Shuali lowered her head and looked at Ai Wei's hand. She smiled and said, "It was Wen Yuan who came to me. I don't think it has anything to do with lawyer Ai. I'm Yi Mulin's chief consultant now and I help him deal with a lot of things." Ai Wei remained calm. She had never put a girl like Bai Shuali in her eyes. Now that the Bai family had fallen she wouldn't. She just didn't understand why Knight would value her so much and did so many things for her. Each one of them was enough to crush him into pieces in the political arena. After she finished speaking, Bai Shuali chuckled and looked up at Ai Wei. "Including helping him deal with the women around him? He gave you the right to do that." Then she pretended to take out her phone to call Yi Mulin. Ai Wei was shocked and slammed Bai Shuali's phone on the ground. The screen was broken. Not only Bai Shuali but Ai Wei was also stunned. She looked at the phone for a long time and finally picked it up and returned it to Bai Shuali. She said stiffly, "I'll buy one for you. Are you afraid that I'll tell him? Doesn't he want you to stay by his side?" Bai Shuali smiled faintly. Ai Wei's expression immediately changed and became extremely ugly. After a long time she said in a low voice, "Maybe you don't believe me, but I'm the kind of woman who is willing to help him. I don't have to be with him but I want to see him fly higher. He's a new star in the political arena. He can completely surpass your father and his own father. Don't you want to see him reach the highest position?" Ai Wei's expression was a little agitated, so agitated that it was almost distorted. Bai Shuali smiled faintly. "Then you can express your efforts to Yi Mulin. Maybe he'll be moved and accept you as his 4th or 5th wife. After all, I'm the mistress." Ai Wei's face paled. "Bai Shuali, do you have any shame? You're the shameless one." Bai Shuali sneered, "I was pestered by Yi Mulin himself. What about you? Why are you pestering a man all the time?" He hired you to work, not to hire you to be his housekeeper. Ai Wei did not expect Bai Shuali's mouth to become so sharp. She gritted her teeth and said, "You are not worthy of him at all." Bai Shuali sneered and looked at Ai Wei. "Is that so? Then what kind of woman do you think is worthy of him? She can watch him sleep with another woman just because she can help him climb higher?" She paused and smiled faintly. "Then he's no different from a duck. He's just a little more advanced." Chapter 3584. As she said that, she stretched her body and wanted to leave. Ai Wei stood beside her and said softly, "Bai Shuali, that person won't be you. Now that the Bai family has fallen, you can no longer stand beside him openly." "Is that so?" Bai Shuali turned around and looked at Ai Wei. "Then it won't be a commoner like you. Since it can't be you, what are you doing? At least I can enjoy his money and his body. As for you, you can only work for him until you vomit blood." Ai Wei was such a proud person that she almost vomited blood upon hearing those words. She glared at Bai Shuali. "Bai Shuali, don't go overboard." "Overboard?" Bai Shuali laughed. "I don't think so." She smiled mischievously and left. However, her mood had changed completely. In the end, she did not have the mood to shop anymore. She ate something outside and thought for a while before heading to the hospital to visit Mrs. Bai. She did not enter and merely watched from afar. She saw that her mother was well taken care of and her face was filled with joy. She watched quietly for a while before returning to the city to get a new phone. It was the same model as Yi Mulin's. Actually, it was not suitable for girls, but the same thing made her feel at ease. At this moment she missed him. In the same city, they had only been apart for 5 to 6 hours and she was already missing him. She was very tired last night, but now she felt as though she had eaten a feast. She was full at that time and hungry after digesting it. She missed him so much and wanted to hug him and be possessed by him. She bit her lips, feeling that she was a little shameless, but she really missed him. She took a taxi back to the apartment and looked at the time. It was 3 in the afternoon. Hence she watched television while waiting for him. However, she was too tired last night and fell asleep while waiting. When she was in a daze, she felt someone kissing her and calling her name. "Shuali." She opened her eyes and looked at him with a dazed expression. "You're back?" Then she smelled a faint scent of perfume on him. It was very elegant. She guessed that it must be Wen Yuan's perfume. She did not want to care, but she still did. She grabbed his collar and searched everywhere. Yi Mulin's eyes darkened and he smiled faintly. "What are you looking at?" Bai Shuali bit her lip. "I'm checking if there are lipstick marks on your collar." Yi Mulin chuckled and reached out to unbutton his shirt. "How about I take it off for you to examine it slowly?" In fact, he didn't have this intention at first. He had to go to the airport in an hour, but her soft appearance still tempted him. So although he was a little absent-minded, he still wanted to do it. Bai Shuali was a little dumbfounded. He stared at him blankly, then he smiled. "How is it?" she stammered. After he took off his jacket, his shirt fluttered in her face, bringing with it a faint scent of perfume and his unique scent. Bai Shuali was furious. She bit her lips and tore off her shirt. She gritted her teeth and said, "Yi Mulin, why do you have her perfume on you? Have you ever hugged her?" He stared at her and smiled. "She's my girlfriend. Isn't it normal for me to hug her?" Her eyes were red with anger. "Yi Mulin, you bastard." Chapter 3585. She glared at him. "I'm not a mistress." She turned around and sat on him, strangling his neck. "Yi Mulin, who are you calling a mistress? Tell me." He chuckled and pinched her face. "Who is it if not you?" She bit her lip and turned her face away. She wanted to climb down silently, but he held her waist. "Are you angry? Where's the vibe of my wife when you came back early in the morning?" She didn't say a word. After a while, she asked him sullenly, "Have you kissed her?" She looked aggrieved and weak, looking pitiful. Yi Mulin sighed. "Shuali, you don't believe me?" He held her hand and pulled it to an indescribable place. "I've hugged and kissed her. How can you still be like this?" She looked at him with her eyes wide open as if she was scalded. He smiled faintly and caressed her face. "Didn't you miss me before, huh?" She stuttered again. "Yi Mulin, how did you know?" He pulled her down and kissed her, murmuring, "Because I'm your man." After that, the atmosphere was so romantic that neither of them had time to talk. After flirting for nearly an hour, he calmed down a little before tidying up a little and bringing her out. After getting into the car, he said in a low voice, "We had dinner on the plane and it was just the two of us this time. Uncle Hao and my mother will be returning to City H in 2 days. They have some private matters to attend to." Bai Shuali sat beside him, a little confused. After a while she whispered, "Oh, what about when Yuan?" Yi Mulin was driving. He tilted his head and looked at her jealous face. He smiled and said, "You finally care, don't you?" He paused and thought for a while. "Did you meet anyone today?" She looked at him. "No one." He stared at her eyes and smiled. "Shueli, tell me the truth." She looked down. "It's just Ma Chunhua." "Oh yeah, do you remember her? She's a very fat girl." Yi Mulin didn't change his expression. "Why would I remember a woman who isn't pretty?" Bai Shuali was shocked by his words. After a long while she whispered, "But you weren't like this before. You weren't so superficial as to only look at looks." "Why not?" He lit a cigarette and laughed. "If I didn't look at your appearance, do you think I would like you, Bai Shao-san?" He called her little Bai San again, infuriating her. She glared at him. "If you call me again, I'll leave." He was driving and smoking, but his eyes were full of affection. "You can't bear to." He was so determined to be a scoundrel that she couldn't do anything about it. She turned her face away, feeling a little uncomfortable. Yi Mulin smiled and brought up the same topic again. "Other than Ma Pang Pang, who else did you meet?" "Her name is Ma Chunhua, not Ma Pang Pang." Bai Shuali bit her lip. Yi Mulin smiled. "Did you see Ai Wei?" He had inadvertently hit the spot. Her eyes widened in disbelief. He looked at her and smiled. "Strange. She's back in B City. Other than what she said, there's no one else who can make you care so much." Bai Shuali was stunned for a moment, and the words he said next made her even more ashamed and resentful. He still held her hand and affectionately said, "Now do you believe that I liked you because of your appearance? You easily fell into little Bai Sen's trap with just 2 or 3 sentences. If you aren't an idiot, then what are you?" He paused for a moment and said generously, "Fortunately, I don't mind and have low expectations." Bai Shuali was instantly shocked by his words. Chapter 3586. She looked at him silently and felt that he was very shameless. Yi Mulin chuckled softly and focused on driving all the way to the airport. Bai Shuali fell asleep and he carried her out of the car. The luggage was carried by the staff and they said softly, "Boss Yi, do you want to wake her up? You're too tired carrying her like this." "No need." Yi Mulin's voice was low and hoarse. "I'll carry her." As he said that, he carried Bai Shuali straight to the private plane. After sitting down, he carefully took off her coat and helped her adjust her seat. Then he took off his coat and only wore a sweater. He asked the stewardess for a cup of coffee and began to look at the official documents. It was the itinerary for the next day. Secretary Li was also on the same plane. She reminded him quietly, "Boss Yi, you can only have 1 cup of coffee. Your stomach can't suffer like this." Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment and then smiled. "That's true." After saying that, he asked Secretary Li to put away the empty coffee cup and continued to look at the official documents. It was only 2 hours from B City to H City. Soon the plane landed. Yi Mulin rubbed his eyes and looked at Bai Shuali, who was sleeping like a piglet. He reached out and pinched her little face. "Shuali, we're here." She opened her eyes in a daze and looked around. "Yi Mulin, everyone is here?" He smiled. "Yes, we're here. We're alighting." As he said that, he unbuckled his seatbelt and helped her unbuckle it. He looked at her and said, "Do you want to walk by yourself or do you want me to carry you?" "I'll walk by myself," she said quickly. However, he had already carried her. Bai Shuali reached out and hit his shoulder. She said softly, "Didn't you say that I could choose by myself?" He smiled. "I changed my mind. I want to carry you, Bai Shaosen." She glared at him angrily. He called her Bai Shaosen again. Yi Mulin chuckled and carried her down. Secretary Li's eyes were sparkling. How doting. In the car, Secretary Li sat in the front while Bai Shuali and Yi Mulin sat in the back. She saw that Yi Mulin was about to take out his notebook to deal with the official documents again. She quickly lay on his lap. "I'm so sleepy." Yi Mulin looked at her and said calmly, "Bai Shaosen, I want to work." "I don't care." A mistress is a scourge of a sugar daddy. She laid flat on his lap, looking like a rascal to the end. Yimulin was annoyed and amused at the same time. He couldn't do anything to her, so he stared at her. By Shuali. Her voice was also very soft. I heard it. Then she looked at him and blinked. I won't let you work. She wrapped her arms around his waist shamelessly. I care about you. If something were to happen to you, what would I do? She rubbed her face against his stomach as she spoke. He smiled and touched her little head. Isn't it just letting me rest? Beating around the bush, it's really hard for a simple mind like yours. She screamed and glared at him. Yimulin was amused. He reached out and stroked her soft hair. His voice was a little low. Then I'll sleep for a while. She nodded and obediently lay in his arms. Later they fell asleep together. When they woke up, they had already arrived at Sinan Mansion. It was already dark. Yimulin got off the car with Bai Shuali and asked the driver to send Secretary Li to her apartment. Watching the car drive away, Bai Shuali looked at Yimulin. Do you still have to work tonight? Chapter 3587. As he was about to walk into the villa, Bai Shuali pulled him back and said softly, Yimulin, let me ask you. What position do you want to climb to? He looked at her for a long time before smiling warmly. Why are you asking this? She looked at him and said stubbornly, Yimulin, I want to know. He looked down and thought carefully before saying softly, to a position that can protect you. It's just right. She bit her lip and made an oh sound. Then she placed her shoulder on his shoulder and wrapped an arm around his waist. She said very quietly, Yimulin, I don't want to be a mistress. His heart warmed a little and then he said softly, I got it. When they returned to the villa, the servants were not there. He made a simple meal and she wanted to learn. He let her be, but she didn't learn anything after teaching him for a long time. She started to cause trouble for him. At night, he continued to do it with her passionately. Bai Shuali was afraid that his body couldn't take it, so she bit her finger and pushed him. No more. Yimulin didn't let go of her and said in a low voice, You've starved me for a long time. She looked at his face that was dyed with jade and couldn't bear to reject him, so she gave in. The next day Yimulin went to work. After listening to Secretary Li's schedule in the office, he tightened his grip on the cup and said calmly, Ask Ai Wei to come over. Secretary Li's heart tightened. She knew that it was not a good thing. She hesitated for a moment and said, I'll call her. She walked over in her high heels and knocked on Ai Wei's office door. Consultant Ai, Elder Yi is looking for you. Secretary Li knew that Ai Wei must have offended Elder Ye's family. In the past 2 years Ai Wei had done a lot of things for Yimulin, but her treatment was not bad. Moreover, subordinates were not allowed to interfere with their superior's private life. Lawyer Ai thought too highly of herself. After Secretary Li said that, Ai Wei's face sank. She looked at Secretary Li and asked, What did Elder Yi say? Secretary Li shook her head. No, but she didn't look very happy. Ai Wei lowered her head and murmured, Then Bai Shuali must have said something to her. Secretary Li listened and couldn't help but say, Lawyer Ai, I don't know if I should say something. Ai Wei looked at her. Secretary Li sighed softly. Without Miss Bai, there wouldn't be today's Mr. S. Haven't you seen it clearly? Ai Wei was a little shaken. She looked at Secretary Li and murmured, How can it be? How can it be? He's such an outstanding person. Bai Shuali will only drag him down. That's also because of love. He was willing. Secretary Li smiled indifferently. Lawyer Ai, you're thinking too much. She still didn't say the words self-made love directly. Ai Wei's expression was a little ugly. She ignored Secretary Li and walked directly to Yimulin's office. She entered and gently closed the door. Mulin, were you looking for me? Call me S. Leader Yi. Yimulin's voice was very calm. He put down the pen in his hand and looked up at Ai Wei. Sit on the sofa. Ai Wei was a little uncomfortable with his attitude, but she still sat down. Yimulin sat on the sofa opposite her and said calmly, You met Shirley? I mean in B City? Chapter 3588. No, I guessed, he said calmly. Shweli is very innocent and everything is written on her face. Ai Wei, I'm talking to you today to tell you not to bully her. I used to say this and I will still say this now and in the future. AI Wei couldn't sit still anymore. She said in a low voice, "Are you helping her to vent her anger now?" Yi Mulin stared into AI Wei's eyes and said slowly, "It's obvious, isn't it?" He paused and ignored AI Wei's pale face. He continued, "We only have a working relationship. Don't cross the line in the future. Otherwise, I won't keep a consultant who interferes with my private life by my side. Do you understand?" AI Wei's lips trembled. She asked unwillingly, "Yi Mulin, I really want to know what you love about her." Yi Mulin suddenly remembered the conversation he had with Bai Shueli about her appearance. He said that he liked her appearance. He did like her, but he probably liked her personality. She was innocent, coquettish and shallow. It was easy to get along with her because he could bully her as much as he wanted. After they got married he did bully her often. It was just that he couldn't bear to bully her anymore. Yi Mulin's face softened as he thought of this. There was gentleness in his eyes too. It was something AI Wei had never seen before. She couldn't express the sadness in her heart, but she forced herself to cheer up. "I'd rather you choose when you on." Yi Mulin came back to his senses. He looked at AI Wei and said calmly, "You don't need to ask about my affairs." He couldn't take it anymore. His tone became colder and colder. "AI Wei, resign." AI Wei's breath stopped. "Yi, you fired me because of her?" She stood up and became emotional. She stared at him. "I resigned from my position in a multinational company because of you. I've done a lot for you since I came to H City. I won't keep anyone who hurts her by my side." Yi Mulin's voice sounded ruthless. AI Wei was hurt. She stared at his eyes. "Yi Mulin, how could you do this?" "I can. Besides, it's your choice to resign. If a person can't even plan his life well, then he's not a mature person." He added calmly. AI Wei closed her eyes. "Are you going to go back to B City? That man-eating place?" She didn't believe that he would leave her behind. However, AI Wei had overestimated herself. Yi Mulin was very determined to fire her. What he didn't tell her was that he was ruthless to himself and Shueli by using her. In other words, he was using AI Wei. But it didn't matter as long as he could achieve his goal. AI smiled, the corners of his mouth trembling slightly. "It's really not bad. But Leader Yi, let me tell you something. Wen Yuan can tolerate the matter between you and Bai Shueli, but the Wen family might not be able to. The Bai family has been defeated and there are a lot of people who want to beat a dog when it's down. Of course they might beat the dog to see who its master is." Just as she finished speaking, Yi Mulin narrowed his eyes and glared at AI Wei. His eyes were filled with rage. "AI Wei, what did you do?" Chapter 3589. Yi Mulin stared at her. "You're crazy." She had been spying on him and Bai Shueli. It was done secretly, but AI Wei knew it. AI Wei didn't care about his anger. She smiled gently. "Eavesdropping is the basic skill of lawyers. See, you've been in politics for so long. How could you forget it? Get out." Yi Mulin's voice was cold, but then he changed his mind. He pressed the internal line. "Guards, come in and arrest Consultant AI." AI Wei was stunned. Then she shouted, "Yi Mulin, you can't do this to me. You can't do this to me." But it was useless even if she shouted hoarsely. She had to eat the bitter fruit. After Yi Mulin conveyed the order, the guards immediately came over. They restrained AI Wei and waited for Yi Mulin's instructions. Yi Mulin said in a low voice, "Lock her in the rape room. No one is allowed to let her out without my order and no one is allowed to come to see her." After that he took his coat and went out. He called Bai Shueli as he walked. No one answered the phone. He gritted his teeth and quickly jumped into the car to drive back to Sinan Mansion. On the way he called a few more times but she still didn't answer. Yi Mulin stepped on the accelerator and drove back to the villa. He opened the door of the villa and walked upstairs quickly. When he reached the bedroom he was stunned. Clothes were strewn everywhere from the outside to the inside. Her black lace underwear was strewn all over the place. His heart was trembling. He was afraid that something had happened to her. He went straight to the bathroom and opened the door. Bai Shueli was lying in the bathtub with her head on the edge of the bathtub. Her face was red as if she was asleep. Her long black hair was scattered like seaweed. Her lips were red and slightly opened, which was very attractive. She was very hateful. She was soaking in the bath comfortably and he was scared to death. Yimulin patted her face and lowered his voice. Surely the water is cold. Why did you fall asleep? She opened her eyes. You're back? Then she looked around. Why did you come back so early in the morning? After saying that, she got up from the bathtub. Then Yimulin had a nosebleed. Then there was a moment of chaos. She covered his nose to stop the bleeding. She was still dripping water, so his clothes were all wet. He was young and full of vigor. He had been extremely restrained these past few days, so it was inevitable that he would go off the deep end. Finally, he couldn't look at the bed anymore. Rather than saying it was an adultery scene, it was more like a crime scene. Yimulin leaned against the headboard and talked to Secretary Li on the phone. Bai Shuli was lying in front of him, disinfecting his nose and wiping his face with tissue paper. She complained in a low voice, "You're already so old, yet you don't control yourself. There's blood everywhere. People who don't know might think that I took your virginity." Amused, he hung up the phone and looked at her. "Will there be blood?" She rolled her eyes at him. "You didn't go to work during the day just to come back and have sex? How rude." He did not intend to explain too much to her and just said calmly, "Don't go out for the time being. Also, Ai Wei has been fired by me, so you don't have to bother with her in the future." Bai Shuli was a little surprised and looked at him eagerly. He smiled faintly. "Is it strange?" Bai Shuli asked very slowly, "What did she do?" Yimulin said calmly, "She caused you trouble." Chapter 3590. He didn't want to put too much pressure on her, so he just said, "She took our photos and sent them to the Wen family." Bai Shuli's eyes widened. Why did she do that? Yimulin didn't answer the question. He just reached out and rubbed her little head with a smile. After lying down for a while, he recovered his vital energy and went back to work. However, he called over 4 guards to protect the villa. Bai Shuli looked at the guards through the window and felt uneasy. Yimulin whispered, "Don't go out these few days. I'm afraid that the Wen family will harm you." He hugged her and put his chin on her hair. He looked a little worried, but he didn't let her see. At this time he was surrounded by enemies. He had to protect Shueli and his father, so he had to pretend to be polite to the Wen family. This was the price he had to pay for this. There was no way back. He hugged her for a while and closed his eyes. "Shueli, I'm going to work. Be good at home. If you go to my mother's place, ask someone to follow you, okay?" He was worried about her, so he didn't hide it completely. Letting her know the danger was also a kind of protection. She turned around in his arms, tidied up his clothes and looked up. "I'll wait for you." Yimulin kissed her forehead. "Good girl." She bit her lips, looked at him and whispered, "Yimulin, can you not come back suddenly in the future?" He was going to leave, but he was a little reluctant to see her like this. He lowered his head. "How am I?" "You'll be very tired." She put her little hand on his button and pulled it gently. "You've been very intemperate recently." There was a little complaint in her tone, which made the little anxiety in his heart go away. He smiled. "Bai Shaosan, I've been very restrained." He kissed her again and said reluctantly, "I really have to go. I have a meeting later." He raised his hand and looked at his watch. "I haven't seen the content of the meeting yet. I've spent all my time on you." He smiled, and it was a rather ambiguous smile. Bai Shuali blushed and hugged his waist. "You're obviously a pervert." Yimulin just smiled. He didn't have time to flirt with her anymore. He tidied up his clothes and went downstairs. When he returned to the municipal government and returned to his office after the meeting, he remembered that Ai Wei was still locked up. He thought about it carefully and went to see her in person. The door opened and Ai Wei sat on the chair, looking at Yimulin against the light. "You went back and confirmed that she was fine, right?" Ai Wei's voice was a little tense. Yimulin's voice was indifferent. "Ai Wei, you should leave. You can resign and go abroad or anywhere else, just don't let me see you." She held her breath. Have you thought this through? You're in danger. If there are fewer stupid people like you around, I think the danger will be much lower." Yimulin's voice was indifferent. "If it weren't for our past relationship, I wouldn't have let you go. Because those photos would put Shirley in danger at any time unless he left her." Yimulin could not endure the loneliness of the long nights. He could not endure the days without her. Otherwise, he did not know how he would survive. After he finished speaking, he did not look at Ai Wei again and walked straight out to have the guards withdraw. Chapter 3591. Spring was warm and the flowers bloomed. The days that followed were very sweet and stable. Bai Shuali waited for him at Sinan residence. Every night she would go out for a walk and sometimes she would chat with Su Fu or arrange flowers. Every month she would go back to B City to visit her mother. The doctor said that her mother's condition was under control and that she might be back to normal in less than a year. There was also good news from her father. He was doing very well and was taken care of there. Bai Shuali knew that it was because of Yi Mulin. Her feelings for him were mixed with many factors. There was love, gratitude, and dependence. She couldn't tell them apart. She liked the feeling of waiting for him at home. It was warm and reassuring. Spring passed and summer came. In winter, Yi Mulin was transferred back to B City and was placed in a very important position. It took him less than 2 years to get this position after he entered politics. Could be called a political miracle. In early winter, Bai Shuali and Yi Mulin moved back to B City together, along with Su Fu and Hao Yun. Because they returned to B City, Hao Yun resigned and became a professor at Tsinghua University, teaching Mandarin. Professor Hao's students all knew that Professor Hao had a very beautiful wife. They called her Mistress Su Fu. Mistress came to send lunch to Professor Hao every day. They were very close. After a month or two, the weather in B City became colder, and Yi Mulin became busier. After returning home, he often fell asleep in bed without taking off his clothes. Bai Shuali wouldn't wake him up no matter how hard she called him. Because of this, she complained many times that he was getting greasy, but he just laughed it off. Early in the morning, Bai Shuali woke up. Looking at the ice on the window, she was a little lost in thought. Just then Yi Mulin woke up. He put his face on her neck and kissed her lightly. "What are you thinking about?" His voice was hoarse and had a unique magnetism to it. Bai Shuali withdrew her gaze and looked at his black head. She asked absent-mindedly, "What time did you come back last night?" She would usually wait for him, but she couldn't stand it and wanted to sleep at 12 o'clock, so she didn't know what time he came back. Yi Mulin nibbled her intently and smiled. "Almost 2 o'clock. There was a celebration party last night, so I had to entertain." She made a sound of agreement and reached out to stroke his hair. She said in a low voice, "Then you should drink less. If you keep drinking like this, your stomach won't be well." He chuckled and buried his face. She gasped. "Stop fooling around. I'm going to make breakfast. You have to go to work later." Yi Mulin looked up and took the watch from the bedside table. He placed it beside the pillow and glanced at it. "There's still half an hour. I'll hurry." She couldn't stand him anymore. It was true. He was very busy. He couldn't make do with many things. In private, he definitely didn't behave like a noble young master. But this matter, he wasn't willing to make do. He would find a chance to do it. She was more tolerant of him, so she was usually very cooperative when he wanted her. Only when she really had no energy would she twist her little face and let him do whatever he wanted. In any case, whether she was cooperative or not, his character was very good. Just like now, she had no strength left. She bit her fist and endured it. When she turned her head, she saw that his watch was pointing at 7 o'clock. She quickly pushed him. "Aya, it's already time." He kissed the tip of her sweaty nose and said in a low voice, "Wait a little longer." Chapter 3592. He had been very tired recently. He kept forgetting things and he kept forgetting to use them. Yi Mulin pressed one hand on her shoulder and kissed her. He reached into the bedside cabinet and took out a small thing. After that, he buried his face in her neck. "Sleep a little longer. I'll take a shower and make breakfast myself." He kissed her as he said that. "I'll get up and do it. You can have a good shave," she complained. "You pricked me just now." When she said that, he chuckled softly. He caressed her neck with his beard and said in a low voice, "Where did it hurt, huh?" She couldn't love him like this. She bit her lip. "You know it. You're so bad." She bit his lip. "I'll get up and make breakfast." With that said, she crawled out from under him and took a quick shower. Just as she was about to put on her clothes, Yi Mulin came over and hugged her. "Together." He pushed him. "You have a meeting later. Stop fooling around, huh?" He was a little dissatisfied. He wiped his face and stood under the shower. "Endless meetings. How many times do I touch you in a month?" She wrapped herself in her bathrobe and said nothing. She went to the kitchen to make breakfast. She finally learned how to cook after a year and she was very good at it. He was busy, but he would always find some time to show his appreciation for her cooking. She fried 2 eggs absent-mindedly, sandwiched them with bread and ham, and drizzled some salad over them. She made 2 hot dogs, the same hot dogs that Wang Skong had eaten. She heated up the milk and fried 2 strips of bacon. She put them together with the bean sprouts that had been soaked in boiling water. Yimulin had come out looking well-dressed. He put on his tie as he walked over and sat down. He smiled. "These hot dogs look familiar." "Yeah, you can try it." She took one for him. "Eat it like this." When he opened his mouth, she took a photo with her phone and showed it to him. Yimulin then remembered why the hot dog looked familiar. He glanced at her. "Naughty." With that said, he pinched her cheek and ate the hot dog to show his appreciation. After he finished, he wiped his hands and drank the milk as he said slowly, "I might come back a little late today." Bai Shuali's hand that was holding the fork paused. She looked up at him and said very slowly, "Is there something?" It was none other than Wen Yuan. Over the past year, the matter between him and Wen Yuan had been dragging on. The man wasn't in a hurry and the woman wasn't in a hurry either. However, the relationship of interests couldn't be easily broken. Naturally, Yimulin could not be severed. As for the Wen clan, they did not dare to and were unwilling to sever their relationship with Yimulin because they had high hopes for Yimulin. How could they be willing to sever their relationship? Wen Yuan and Yimulin were not in a hurry. The ones who were in a hurry were Yi Jinggang and the elders of the Wen family. Therefore, once a month, just like menstruation, they had to organize a family gathering for them. Only the male and female leads were required to attend. With their status, they did not care about love at all. At this time, when this topic was brought up, Bai Shuali couldn't say that she was happy. She could understand him, she really could. She couldn't do anything and couldn't help him. She could only cook for him and wait for him to come back at night. Yimulin's voice was a little hoarse. "Shuali, it's fine." He held her hand. "It's nothing. You know, it's just a meal." Chapter 3593. She loved him, but she couldn't legally own him. Wen Yuan was the only one who could stand by his side. Yimulin looked at her and said softly, "Shuali, it won't be long." He knew that she cared, but he still needed the help of the Wen family. He knew better than she did that her father would not be able to keep his life in prison and that their relationship was over. She would not allow herself to be with him. She replied with a and smiled at him. That faint smile made his heart ache. Yimulin reached out and stroked her hair. "I'll come back early to eat skewers with you, okay?" She replied with an "oh" and said softly, "You better not. Your stomach isn't good. It'll be troublesome if it acts up." He smiled. "Then I'll come back and cook for you. Be good." When it was time for work, he leaned over and kissed her. "I have to go. Be good at home." She replied with an "oh" and kissed him back. "Don't drink too much." He said again, "I'm going." She smiled and watched him go back to his room to get his coat and car keys. In the end, she couldn't help but run to the door to send him off and give him a hug. After Yimulin left, she did the cleaning at home. After they came back, they didn't hire an hourly helper anymore. She just did it at home every day. In the morning, after he went to work, she would clean the house briefly and then go to the supermarket to buy groceries. She would also bring a bunch of flowers back and put them in the house. She would eat casually at noon and cook dinner diligently, regardless of whether he was busy or not. However, he could only eat it once a week and would have to throw it away in the end. She did it mechanically, trying her best to do everything a wife could do. What she was supposed to do when she was his wife, what she could not do now she could not be his wife. Bai Shuali thought as she arranged the flowers, her little face a little blank. In the afternoon, she began to prepare the ingredients for dinner and made a table full of dishes. She knew that he wouldn't come back. He was sitting with Wen Yuan at a family gathering. Perhaps they would discuss the wedding date, she thought to herself. She sat on the sofa and waited until 9 o'clock. She looked at her phone. There was no message. She sat and watched TV. She wasn't hungry and didn't have the mood to eat alone. Later, at 11 o'clock, she poured out the food. She watched silently as she poured out the food, but she still couldn't help crying. Her cries went from suppressed to loud. She knew she might be sick. A disease called loneliness was silently eating away at her. She had always told herself that she was very happy and that she had to understand her. It turned out that it was so painful to watch someone get together with someone else and not be able to see their future together. She believed him, but she was no longer naive. Just like when the Bai family was at its peak, the Yi family had to stand aside. She had never thought that the Bai family would fall. The Bai clan could fall, but what about Yi Mulin? He was surrounded by enemies from all sides. How could he feel like he was treading on thin ice? She waited until 1 or 2 in the morning, but he still hadn't returned. She picked up her cell phone and wanted to call him, but she didn't dare. At this moment, she deeply understood that she was really nothing. Even a phone call was shameful. He called her Little Bai-san, which was a relative. In fact, from a certain point of view, she was indeed 100% Little San. Bai Shuali lay on the bed, unable to fall asleep. Chapter 3594. In the blink of an eye, the election was around the corner. Yi Mulin needed strong support in order to get promoted. The Wen family's support came with a condition, which was to marry Wen Yuan. Yi Mulin didn't say anything and used work as an excuse. Wen Yuan wasn't keen either. It had probably been too long and she had lost the passion of being Mrs. Yi. She sat there, dignified and elegant like a puppet. And the Wen family pressed on. Their words went from hints to bluntness. Yi Mulin drank a lot and socialized. He pretended to be drunk, but he was really drunk. In the end, the Wen family took advantage of the situation and made him stay in the hotel. Wen Yuan, his fiancée, naturally had to take care of him. Yi Mulin lay in the hotel for the whole night. When he woke up, Wen Yuan was sitting on the sofa opposite him. He sat up slightly and rubbed his forehead. "You stayed here for the whole night too?" He was sure that nothing had happened between them because a drunk man couldn't do anything. Wen Yuan sat there. Following the light, he could see that her face was paler than Yi Mulin's. She stared into his eyes and said slowly, "I'm pregnant." Yi Mulin narrowed his eyes and looked at Wen Yuan. "Say that again." "I'm pregnant," Wen Yuan said softly. "It's Mubai's child." Yi Mulin had always known about the ambiguous relationship between her and Yi Mubai, but he didn't think that they would end up getting pregnant. He asked in a low voice, "Whose idea was it?" It was simple to not want to get pregnant. It was also simple to want to get pregnant. One's wish was enough. Wen Yuan said softly, "It's me. I want to get pregnant, but Mubai has lost contact and I can't find him." Yi Mulin frowned. "So you want to find a father for the child in your stomach?" "I'm not looking for a father. After tonight, everyone will know that we slept together. Mubai and Bai Shuali will think so too." Wen Yuan said faintly, "I have no other choice." "Yi Mulin, you have no other choice too." Yi Mulin rarely lost his composure. He couldn't help but lose his temper. "You're crazy, Wen Yuan." "I'm not crazy." Wen Yuan looked at him. "Yi Mulin, I'm just telling you that this is your reward for everything you've done. Yi Mubai and I were set up by you. I don't know where he is now. You can only acknowledge this child." Yi Mulin paced back and forth a few steps and paused. "Are you forcing me to find Mubai?" He sneered. "You like him?" Wen Yuan suddenly shouted at him hoarsely, "Yes, I like him. I'm going crazy. I had a child but he disappeared. What can I do? Yi Mulin, tell me, what should I do?" Yi Mulin calmed down. He looked at Wen Yuan and said, "Think about it carefully. There's no turning back now that you've announced it. Unless he gave up the power in his hands, the Bai family would be finished and so would he. In fact, no matter what, he was finished. This game of power had ended because of Yi Mubai's disappearance." He ignored his headache and dialed Yi Mubai's cell phone. The cold voice of the mobile customer service came through. "Sorry, the number you have dialed is not available." He cursed under his breath and looked at Wen Yuan. "How many days has it been? Why didn't you tell me?" "1 week. Wen Yuan's voice was very calm. "If I tell you, you will have time to plan. I can't give you this opportunity." Chapter 3595. He made a call to King. "Help me check Mubai's whereabouts." With that, he smoked and paced back and forth, waiting for the results. He really wanted to scold someone. Wen Yuan looked at him, her face very pale. Yi Mulin paused and looked at her. Suddenly he thought of Bai Shuali. She had the same expression when she was helpless. His expression softened when he thought of this. Moreover, he was indeed the one who started the relationship between her and Mubai. Just then his phone rang. It was a call from King. His voice was a little serious. There has been no trace of Mubai for almost a week. There are only incoming calls and no outgoing calls. There are no records of any bank transactions either. The only thing we can confirm is that he was last seen in the north. Yi Mulan closed his eyes. You mean, King did not dare to be vague and said in a low voice, something might have happened to him. This disappearance was not good for Yi Mulan. He held the phone for a while before saying hoarsely, help me check again at all costs. He had to find Mubai Dao. This was too important. King nodded. Yi Mubai hung up and looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan's face paled even more. She looked at him and said in a trembling voice, Yi Mulan, I don't want to abort the child. This was Mubai's child. Of course he did not want to abort it. But Wen Yuan was his girlfriend in name. This time he was really treading on thin ice. He said hoarsely, Wen Yuan, give me a few more days. Everything will be fine once I find Mubai. Wen Yuan looked at him, her lips trembling. I want the child because I want to break away from our relationship. I want him to give me an official status. I don't want to continue like this, but he doesn't want me. I thought that he would settle down after having a child. Yi Mulan, is Mubai still in love with Lin Cece? Yi Mulan said in a low voice, that's not important. What was important was that Wen Yuan had a child. He was about to explode. Did women lose their rationality once they fell in love? Could a child solve the problem? He suddenly thought of Shirley. Ever since she had a child, she was especially afraid of having a child. Hence she was even more careful than him. He looked at Wen Yuan again. Wen Yuan hugged himself and said softly, I'm sorry, Yi Mulan. I don't know what to do. I seem to have ruined everything. She lowered her eyes. It's fine if you blame me. No matter what, I must protect this child. This child must be surnamed Yi. He knew very well that if he didn't want to take Mubai's surname, he would have to take his surname. If Wen Yuan told the public that the child was his, no one would doubt him. He wouldn't be able to explain himself even if he had 10 mouths. Yi Mulan sighed. Give me time. Wen Yuan slowly sat down on the sofa and said softly, Yi Mulan, I'll only give you 3 days. If you can't find him, I'll be tied to you for the rest of my life. He'll come back eventually, won't he? Yi Mulan understood that Wen Yuan was going crazy. She wanted to stay at the Yi clan and wait for Mubai. Perhaps it was because he couldn't accept it, or perhaps it was because he loved Mubai, but he didn't even lay a finger on her. Why should he be the scapegoat? He walked to the French window and lit a cigarette. After taking a puff, he said faintly, Wen Yuan, when did you start liking Mubai? Wen Yuan smiled faintly. From the very beginning. Chapter 3596. Yi Mulan's blood almost froze. Wen Yuan continued, do you know how many years I've been his fan? Her eyes were filled with infatuation and fanaticism. This was the Wen Yuan that Yi Mulan had never seen before. He had always thought that Wen Yuan was gentle. However, he had never thought that Wen Yuan could have such great power to like someone. She liked him so quietly that even Yi Mulan's car was overturned. He wiped his face and said calmly, I'll give you an answer in 3 days. Wen Yuan stood up and said, if he doesn't show up in 3 days, I won't abort the child. She looked at Yi Mulan. You know what I mean. In Yi Mulan's heart, however, he could not only care about him and Bai Shuali at this moment. Finding Mubai was the most important thing. When he left the hotel, his face was as gloomy as still water. This was because he knew that he had spent the night here. As long as Wen Yuan was willing, the entire world would know. He couldn't underestimate Wen Yuan, but he couldn't blame her. Yi Mulan returned to the apartment. It was quiet. Bai Shuali hadn't woken up yet. He walked in quietly, took off his shoes and lay behind her, hugging her. Are you angry? Bai Shuali woke up and said softly, you drank a lot last night? He nodded and buried his face in her neck. In a low voice he said, Surely I have something to tell you. She grunted but didn't turn her head. He hugged her tightly and said in an even lower voice, Wen Yuan is pregnant. She stiffened in his arms. He hugged her tightly and said in a low voice, It's not mine. It's Mubai's child. This time Bai Shuali turned around in his arms and looked at him in shock. The meaning in her eyes made him speechless. His face darkened. Do you think Mubai and I will use the same woman? She just stared at him. Yi Mulan sighed softly. I've said that I have nothing to do with Wen Yuan. He rubbed his forehead. But I've also been tricked by her. Surely she has always liked Mubai. She has liked him for many years. Her target has never been me, it's Mubai. Bai Shuali still didn't understand. She has Mubai's child. She just has to marry him. She schemed against the child. Mubai can't find her. Something might have happened. Yi Mulin reached out and caressed her little face. Shuali, if Mubai doesn't appear, I might have to marry him. He didn't say anything else, but Bai Shuali understood. Fame and fortune were not that important to him. He had to think about her father. After he said that, she looked at him and hugged his waist, burying her face in his chest. Yi Mulin, I don't want you to do this. He lowered his head and said gently, it's my fault, Shirley. I gave Yuan a chance. Also, that's Mubai's child and your father. These are all things I can't ignore. He reached out to stroke her hair. I'll find Mubai, okay? She nodded and said, I know. I believe I will find it. Her voice was very soft and there was a hint of caution in her eyes. Yi Mulin kissed her forehead. Be good. Go and make me breakfast. I'll lie down for a while. Chapter 3597. When she woke up in the morning, she felt a little nauseous. She should have told him, but she wasn't sure if she should tell him now. All along, he had been the one carrying the burden and she couldn't help him at all. When Yuan was pregnant and she was afraid that Mubai wouldn't be able to find her. Bai Shuali pursed her lips and quietly made breakfast for him. When she went to wake him up, he had already woken up and had taken a shower. He was only wearing a short towel. For a moment she was speechless. She just stared blankly at him, his sexy abs. He was much thinner than before, but his body was still very attractive. He was strong and well-built and very attractive. She stared at him for a while, but he had already pulled the towel off and threw it over her head. He smiled faintly as he put on his clothes. It's been a few years, but you still haven't seen enough. Bai Shuali pulled the towel off her head and looked at him. When she realized that he was wearing outdoor clothes, she asked in a daze, didn't you say you were going to rest? He buttoned up his shirt, fastened his belt and pressed on her shoulders. Shuali, I have to go find Mubai. He paused. I have to go to the city where he disappeared. She replied obediently, but the expression on her face made his heart ache. For a moment he regretted telling her, but he was afraid that she would misunderstand if he didn't tell her. Yi Mulin paused. I'll bring Mubai back. She bit her lip and hugged him. I'll wait for you. He reached out and stroked her little head. Be more optimistic, okay? She fell on his shoulder and looked at him. He smiled. Shuali, we'll be together. He didn't say anything else. He half hugged and half carried her to the restaurant for breakfast. After eating, he went to the airport. Accompanying him were none other than Hao Yun and Detective KG. They went to Yunnan and located the last place where Yi Mubai disappeared. It was a mountainous area where Yi Mubai's signal had been cut off. The wind was strong. Yi Mulin stood there and looked down. His face was tense. No one was feeling more complicated than him. He was very likely to lose Mubai and Bai Shuali at the same time. Send a search and rescue team and a helicopter. No matter what, we have to find him even if we have to dig 3 feet into the ground, he said calmly. King was in this line of work. He used his personal connections to hire a professional team. Of course, the remuneration was not low. They dug at the border for 3 days and searched everywhere, but they still couldn't find Yi Mubai. But at the foot of the mountain they found Yi Mubai's mobile phone, broken into several pieces. When the search and rescue personnel handed Yi Mubai's phone to Yi Mulin, he held it in his hand and pieced it together piece by piece, as if he was trying to piece Yi Mubai back together. He stood in the wind for a long time before he said in a hoarse voice, "Keep looking." He believed that Mubai was still alive. That day Yi Mulin stood on the cliff for a day and a night. Is Mubai the Mubai that Shuali had loved for so many years? Meanwhile he was gripping the phone fragments in his hand so tightly that his palm was almost bleeding. The night wind was very cold. He stood in the wind until the sky turned white. Hao Yun's voice was blown away by the wind. Mulin, we have to rush back to City B in a while. No matter what, he had to tell Yi Jinggang and Su Fu about Yi Mubai. Hao Yun didn't dare to think if Su Fu could accept such a blow. Chapter 3598. Hao Yun sighed and nodded. "'Kay, I'll stay. Mulin, you go back to B City." Yi Mulin looked at Hao Yun and said hoarsely after a long while, "Uncle Hao, I'll leave this to you." His voice was a little choked. After he finished speaking, he looked at the foot of the mountain. Hao Yun understood his feelings. Hao Yun and Su Fu were married and he naturally treated Su Fu's two sons as his juniors. He was naturally sad, but someone had to do it. He patted Yi Mulin's shoulder and said hoarsely, "Hang in there. You've persevered for so long." Yi Mulin pursed his thin lips, then let out a soft sound of acknowledgement. That day he returned to B City. He told Yi Xinggang about Mubai's disappearance but kept it from Su Fu. Yi Xinggang was silent for a long time and used all his power to look for Yi Mubai. He also blocked the news. The negotiations with the Wen family were difficult because Wen Yuan was pregnant. Nominally, Wen Yuan was Yi Mulin's girlfriend. Yi Xinggang was in a terrible situation. It was already the fourth night when Yi Mulin returned to the apartment. He returned to the apartment and Bai Shuili was sitting on the sofa. The sunset behind her made the entire sky look red. Hearing him open the door, she stood up slowly and looked at him. "How was it? Did you find Mubai?" Yi Mulin shook his head. "I didn't find him." He came over and without saying anything he just hugged her. He hugged her gently and rested his face on her shoulder. "I found his phone at the foot of the mountain. It's broken but I'm still looking for it." Bai Shuili's body froze. After a long while she bit her lip and looked up at him. "Mubai, he'll come back." Yi Mulin pressed her back into his arms and said softly, "He'll definitely come back." "Oh," she replied, but her heart was as heavy as his. She didn't ask him about Wen Yuan or Wen Yuan's pregnancy because she knew the consequences. If she asked, it would be equivalent to forcing him to take a stand and making things difficult for him. She didn't want him to be sad if Mubai couldn't be found. She hugged his neck, put her face on the corner of his chin and said in a low voice, "I believe you." She also did not tell him that she was pregnant. This child had come at such a bad time. She vaguely remembered that on the night they had just returned to B City, he had drunk too much after attending the celebration party and had forced her to come several times that night. He had been in such a hurry that he hadn't been able to take care of her. It had been almost 2 months now and it was time for a reaction. However, she could not tell him that they had another child. She hugged him and placed her hand on his back, gently stroking his back, silently comforting him. It had been so many years and they had been through so much together. She was no longer the childish Bai Shuili. She would think for him and she would empathize with him. She had liked Mu Bai for many years, but she was deeply in love with Yi Mulin. "Wu Lin," she said softly. This seemed to be the first time she called him that. She had always called him Yi Mu Lin. In the past she would occasionally call him husband, but she rarely called him that. She said in a low voice, "You married Wen Yuan, huh?" His body stiffened and he lowered his head to look at her. "Bai Shuili, what are you talking about?" Chapter 3599. As she laughed, she started to cry. Her tears flowed silently. "Just take it that I'm being selfish, okay? I don't want to see my father trapped in prison. I don't want my mother to suffer." Her tears scalded his heart. He looked at her and said hoarsely, "You want me to marry her? What are we going to do?" It wasn't just a marriage in name. With his position he couldn't step down easily and divorce would be difficult. His father was about to retire, so he had to divorce his mother. If he were to marry Wen Yuan, how was he going to divorce? She understood that a marriage with benefits was harder to get rid of than a broken relationship. Bai Shuili bit her lower lip. "This is the best choice, isn't it?" She was fragile, but there was determination in her eyes. "Yi Mulin, you and I both know this." He stared at her and said hoarsely, "I thought you would stand by my side." She chuckled. "How should I put this? We've reached the end. Yi Mulin, you can't possibly think that I'll always be your mistress if you can't marry me. Do you think I'll be happy if you call me little mistress?" She looked down. "Let's do this. You marry Wen Yuan and we're done." Yi Mulin's head hurt. He took a step back and looked at her. "Looks like you've thought about this for a long time. Bai Shuili, is this the only solution you can come up with? What else can I do? Marry me? Then I'll watch my father die and my mother go crazy?" She laughed mockingly and looked straight into his eyes. "Yi Mulin, we've agreed before that I'll be with you and you'll protect my father. Now that you have to marry Wen Yuan, I naturally have to leave you. If I don't leave you, am I going to wait for my father to be killed in prison? Don't tell me that your crazy father can't do it. She murmured, I'm scared. I'm really scared. He stared at her. She smiled at him. You can't possibly think that I came back to you because I like you and love you, right? Yi Mulin clenched his fists and said nonchalantly, of course I did it for my family. The Yi family caused so much trouble for the Bai family. How can I like my enemy? His voice was low. Do you really think so? She bit her trembling lips and closed her eyes. Yes. It doesn't matter if it is or not. I will never allow you to leave me. He stared into her eyes. And I don't believe a word of it. With that, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her crazily, his hands holding her arms tightly, not letting her escape. The kiss was punishing and she had nowhere to run. When it was over, there was blood on her lips. He stared into her eyes and said hoarsely, you'd better not have any thoughts of running away. Otherwise, I'll let you know the meaning of regret. After he finished speaking, he made a phone call and asked Secretary Li to call 4 people over. Bai Shuili was pressed down on the sofa by him. She looked at him in shock. You want to put me under house arrest? He hung up the phone and looked down at her. 2 years at most. He reached out to stroke her hair and smiled, but it was a bitter smile. She understood then that the child in Wen Yuan's stomach had to have a title. But he didn't know that she couldn't wait any longer. Because the child in Wen Yuan's stomach had to have a title, she couldn't. She didn't want to give birth to this child in City B. She didn't want others to look at this illegitimate child with strange eyes. She knew very well that if she gave birth to this child, it would cause a lot of trouble for Yi Mulin and her parents. Chapter 3600. Yi Mulin's men came over and he watched her eat before leaving. Of course, she let them lock her up. When she heard the sound of the front door, she slowly sat up on the bed and reached out to cover her lower abdomen. For the sake of the child, her parents, and Yi Mulin, she had to leave him. At this moment, she thought of Ai Wei's words. Bai Shuili, it was selfish of you to stay by his side. She lowered her eyes and smiled bitterly. Yes, she had been selfish for so long and enjoyed his care for so long. Mu Bai's life and death were not in vain. She really couldn't use the child to make things difficult for him. She really wanted him to be happy. If she left, would he be able to do whatever he wanted? Even if he was tired and couldn't stand in that position one day? She bit her lip and rubbed her abdomen gently. Her heart hurt. She thought about it for a long time and finally called Secretary Li. Yi Mulin stood in his private office, smoking slowly. The office was very dark and he didn't turn on the lights. The dim light shone on the side of his face, making his face look even colder. After a long while, he raised his head and there were tears in the corner of his eyes. What happened to Wen Yuan and Mu Bai was a mistake on his part. Mu Bai's disappearance was an accident that caught him off guard. As a man, everything, including Bai Shuili's emotions, was not as important as Mu Bai's life and death. He was Shuili's man, but he was also Mu Bai's brother. There was only a cigarette butt left between his fingers, but he still called Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan picked up immediately. Yi Mulin's voice was very hoarse. Mu Bai hasn't been found. Wen Yuan was silent for about a minute and then she said softly, I want to see him. She was referring to the scene she was going to. Yi Mulin said that no matter how busy he was, he had to satisfy Wen Yuan's request and calm her down. He had just returned from Yunnan and had a lot of things to do. But in the end he still brought Wen Yuan to Yunnan. Before leaving, he called Bai Shuili and told her that he was going to Yunnan and it would take 2 or 3 days. She listened blankly and didn't say anything. Yi Mulin said softly, Shuili, the situation hasn't reached that stage yet. Don't be discouraged and wait for me, okay? After a long while she nodded. Yi Mulin hung up the phone and set off with Wen Yuan. There was also an obstetrician with them. In his heart he valued Wen Yuan's health very much. Rather than saying that he valued Wen Yuan, it would be more accurate to say that he valued the child in her womb. He had already prepared for the worst. If Mu Bai did not return, then the child in Wen Yuan's womb would be Mu Bai's hope. It was already night when they arrived at the border of Yunnan. The surroundings were pitch black. Wen Yuan stood high up on the cliff, looking down into the bottomless abyss. He cried out in pain, Yi Mu Bai. You're not dead. Come out if you're a man. The tears floated in the night sky and turned into specks of starlight. I've liked you for a long time, Yi Mu Bai. Tears streamed down her face as she muttered, I'm pregnant. Bastard, come out and take responsibility. However, there was only her echo in the valley. Yi Mu Bai had been missing for far too long. Wen Yuan stood there with a blank expression on her face. After a while she turned to look at Yi Mulin and said, I don't care if he's dead or alive. I'm going to marry him. Chapter 3601. He understood that she had forced him before because she wanted him to look for Yi Mu Bai. However, with the current situation she could no longer hide it. She wanted to give birth to Yi Mu Bai's child. She wanted everyone in this world to admit that this was Yi Mu Bai's child. It wasn't Yi Mulin's, it wasn't any man's, it was Yi Mu Bai's. That was very important. Maybe she would be kicked out by the Wen family because she had gone against their will. Maybe she would lose everything, but she wouldn't regret it because she had loved before. Yi Mulin stood beside her. After a while he put his hand on her shoulder and hugged her thin body to give her some warmth. Wen Yuan couldn't help crying. She leaned on his shoulder and sobbed, I'm sorry, Yi Mulin. I've been lying to you. What could he say? He could only say that he had wanted to use her, but it had been a freak accident. Wen Yuan stood there for half the night and only went back in the wee hours of the morning. When the sun rose they went out again. She stared at the search and rescue without blinking. Yi Mulin asked someone to set up a small tent for Wen Yuan to stay inside, but she would always run out. Yi Mulin couldn't do anything about her. In the morning he received a call. It was a guard who had been transferred from home. He looked at the phone and frowned. Then he picked up the call. What's the matter? Mr. Yi, Miss Bai is missing, the man said in a trembling voice. Yi Mulin tightened his grip on the phone. How could she be missing? Yesterday Secretary Li came by. When Secretary Li left, she left alone, but we don't know why it was Secretary Li who stayed in the apartment this morning, the man said with a trembling voice. He wished he could crawl into a hole and hide. Yi Mulin's voice was tense. I'll come back immediately and keep Secretary Li here. He hung up the phone and walked towards Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan stood there and looked at the misty cliff. She tilted her head and looked at him. Yi Mulin walked over and paused. Wen Yuan, I have to go back to B City. Shuali is missing. She thought I would marry you. Wen Yuan was a little surprised. Then he smiled faintly and said, Go back and explain it to her. She paused. I'll deal with the Wen family. Yi Mulin, thank you. Finally she said she would go back in 3 days whether she could find it or not. At that moment the morning light shone on her face. He could see the determination on her face. However, Yi Mulin knew that this was easier said than done. Her parents and family would definitely force her not to have this child. It would be fine if Mu Bai was around, but if Mu Bai could not be found, it would not be easy for her to keep the child. Yi Mulin whispered, When you return to B City, come and find me. The child is Mu Bai's. As the child's uncle, there's no reason for me to not care. As he spoke he held Wen Yuan's hand. At this moment he did not expect that Bai Shuali would run away with her child. When he returned to his apartment in B City, Secretary Li was still there. Under Yi Mulin's interrogation, Secretary Li confessed in a few words that it was Bai Shuali who begged her. She softened her heart and let her go. Yi Mulin did not make things difficult for her and let her go. He kept calling Bai Shuali but her phone was turned off. He started to look for her. He searched B City's high-speed rail station, the airport and even the bus station, but he found nothing. He was sure that she had taken a taxi and left, but he didn't know where she had gone. Chapter 3602. King was dispatched as well. Later on, King told him that Bai Shuali must have had someone helping her. Otherwise there wouldn't have been no records. Later on Yi Mulin checked Bai Shuali's passport records. It showed that she had left the country. She was in France. He chased her all the way to France but couldn't find her. He would always chase after her but she would always escape. He had lost a lot of weight. He would look forward to seeing her on every street. When he was looking for her he would always feel that she was behind him and could call his name at any time. Yi Mulin. He would always turn around but she was always not there. At that time he would stand there for a very very long time. He was mentally and physically exhausted. He knew why she left. It wasn't just for the Bai family. She didn't want to make things difficult for him. He didn't believe a single word that Bai Shuali didn't love Yi Mulan. He would never believe it. A week later he couldn't continue searching. His work didn't allow him to stay overseas anymore. He returned to B City. Wen Yuan did the same. Wen Yuan silently took out something. It was a tail ring that the rescue team had found. And this used to belong to Mubai. She said softly, there was blood at the scene and some other things. We did a DNA test, it was Mubai. After Wen Yuan finished speaking, her tears fell one by one. She lowered her eyes and held the ring tightly in her hand. Yi Mulan was silent. He looked at Wen Yuan and after a long time he placed his hand on her shoulder and said in a hoarse voice, "What are you going to do next?" He couldn't watch Wen Yuan fight against the Wen family. He couldn't watch her give birth to this child under everyone's gazes. He said, "Wen Yuan, let's get married. You can have your freedom just like before." She looked at him. He smiled bitterly. "I'm not just doing this for you, I'm doing this for myself." He sighed. "She will only come back with peace of mind if I get married." Wen Yuan was stunned. A week later the Yi family and the Wen family held a grand wedding. As for Yi Mubai's matter, it wasn't announced to the public. Xu Fu guessed it. He sat at home alone for a long time, not allowing anyone to talk. Yi Mulan brought Wen Yuan over. Xu Fu sat by the window in a daze. Yi Mulan squatted in front of her and placed his hand on the back of her hand. He said softly, "Mom, Wen Yuan and I have come to see you." Xu Fu looked up at his son and forced a smile. "You and Wen Yuan." Before she could finish, Yi Mulan interrupted her. "Mom, Wen Yuan and I are fake married. Wen Yuan is pregnant. It's Mubai's child." After he finished speaking, Xu Fu was stunned. Her eyes were filled with disbelief and sorrow. She then turned to Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan bit his lips and called out "Mom" in a trembling voice. However, this time he called her Mom, after Mubai. She was Mubai's flesh and blood. She was his wife. Xu Fu was shocked. However, when she thought she might lose Mubai, Wen Yuan was pregnant with Mubai's child. Her heart was comforted a lot. She closed her eyes and hugged Wen Yuan gently. Wen Yuan also hugged Xu Fu gently. Mubai's blood flowed in her body, which slightly healed the pain in Xu Fu's heart. Whether Yi Mubai was dead or alive seemed to have been decided. Apart from the blood-stained clothes and his tail ring, nothing else could be found. Spring passed and summer arrived. At the end of summer, autumn came. In the late autumn, Wen Yuan gave birth to a boy. He was named Yi Xiangnan. Chapter 3603. Wen Yuan made a trip to Yunnan after her confinement. She brought Xiangnan along with her. She stood there with the child in her arms for about half an hour. Then she whispered, "He should have seen it, right?" Yi Mulan hugged her shoulders silently and carried the child for her. In front of others, he and Wen Yuan were a respectful couple. Behind the scenes, he took care of her like a family member. He bought a villa with Wen Yuan's name written on it. She lived upstairs and he lived downstairs. The servants in the house were all his confidants and no one would treat them as a couple. Year after year, the one from the Bai family was released from prison. Yi Mulan asked Hao Yun to make arrangements to sell the Bai family's old house and buy a 160 square meter house for the two elders of the Bai family. The extra money would be enough for them to retire. Mrs. Bai's spirit was also much better and she was discharged from the hospital. Yi Mulan did not visit them because he was Wen Yuan's husband in name. If he went to see them, he was afraid that Bai Shuali would not come back. Day by day he became more introverted and silent. There were children and Wen Yuan in this house, but he was very lonely. He often missed Bai Shuali after he finished his work. He wondered when she would come back. It had been so long he could not tell if it was 2 or 3 years. Yi Xiangnan was about to go to school but she had not come back. He missed her, this heartless idiot. He thought of retiring and giving up because he was very tired. He wanted to go all over the world to catch her, but after so long, his heart was slowly hardening. Didn't she have the ability to leave? She had legs, why didn't she come back herself? He had been lonely all this time and hated her day by day. The only thing that could comfort him was little White. After a few years, it had already grown into a young lady. Yi Mulan didn't know if it was because he had been single for too long. Even when he looked at a little turtle, he felt that it had delicate features. Wen Yuan was still working. She taught music at the university and played the piano exceptionally well. Yi Mulin had heard her play and felt that it was a pity that she was not an artist. However, Wen Yuan had no interest in those things. She told him that her greatest interest in this life was Yi Mubai, who was now his son. Yi Mulin was a little envious of Bai Shuili. If only Bai Shuili was half as determined as she was. He thought to himself in his study, smoking a cigarette. At this moment, Wen Yuan knocked on the door and came in. "Can I bother you for a moment?" Although she had lived with him for a long time, they were still distant and polite to each other. Originally, the two of them were not particularly friendly people. Yi Mulin extinguished the cigarette in his hand the moment she walked in. "What's the matter?" She nodded. "Let's have a meal together tomorrow." He smiled. "Why did you get your salary?" Wen Yuan had been supporting himself after his marriage. He did not need Yi Mulin's money. Her income as a teacher was not bad, but it was impossible for her to maintain a luxurious lifestyle. To her, having such a good place to live and a good environment for her son was already very good. At this moment, she also agreed that a fake marriage with him was the best solution. Otherwise, she would be abandoned by the Wen family. If she lost her job, she did not know what kind of life and future she could give her son, so she was especially grateful to Yi Mulin. She waved the thing in her hand. "I got a job. A famous musician is sick and can't attend her concert. I'm going to be her substitute." As soon as she finished speaking, Yi Mulin frowned. "This is fake." Wen Yuan gave a figure. 2 million. I only need to play for 2 hours. That's 3 years' salary. Yi Mulin sighed. "You can tell me if you need money." Wen Yuan shook his head. "I don't need money. I just want to save more. In the future, Xiangnan. Maybe I'll bring him overseas to visit the places Mubai has been to. There are many places where money is needed." He had thought about it before. She could not always be by his side. She and Yi Mulin would have to break off the engagement eventually. She wanted to buy a house. A house in B City would cost at least 10 million. She actually needed money, but her pride did not allow her to say it. Hearing her words, Yi Mulin nodded. "All right then. Just be careful and don't bring trouble to yourself. We'll have a meal after we get the money. It's to thank you for taking care of me." Wen Yuan smiled. "Also, this is Xiangnan's wish. He always thinks that you are too serious." At the mention of Xiangnan, Yi Mulin could not help but smile. He liked this child. Xiangnan was very much like Mubai when he was young. He was very clever. Xiangnan called him uncle at home and father outside. It was probably Wen Yuan who taught him. It was hard for Xiangnan to not make mistakes at such a young age. He would be amazing when he grew up. He thought for a while. "When is the concert? I'll go and support it even though I'll be using someone else's name." Chapter 3604. In the past 2 to 3 years he had already reached a very high position. Yi Xinggang had retired and Yi Mulin was in that position. His every move was eye-catching. The higher he was, the more uneasy Wen Yuan felt. She thought about it and said, "It's about time. Why don't we dissolve the marriage? It's not good to drag it out for too long." Yi Mulin closed the document in his hand and said calmly, "Let's do that for now." Wen Yuan couldn't say too much after he said that. She said goodnight and left. Yi Mulin sat there not in the mood to deal with work. He reached out and picked up a photo frame. It was a photo of him and Bai Shuili. She was nestled in his arms, smiling happily. They had taken that photo in H City. Thinking back to those days, he felt sweet and a little painful. What kind of mood did she have when she was with him? She left. It had been so long. Yi Mulin smiled helplessly. It wasn't that he couldn't investigate, but he didn't want to. He was also a proud man. His father had already retired and her father had already come out. Nothing could stop them from being together. He didn't come back. Year after year he was almost in despair. He felt that it was possible that she wouldn't come back. Yi Mulin's heart was in a mess. Little White was crawling around in the tank, looking at him with its 2 mung bean-like eyes. Yi Mulin took it out and let it crawl on the desk. After a while he sighed. "You miss your mother too, don't you?" In the end, Yi Mulin still went to watch Wen Yuan's concert. That day the stadium was full. Wen Yuan sat in the middle of the stage with her hair down. She was wearing a white gown and playing the song that made Lin Shui famous. The audience could only see the side of her face. Because they looked similar and the lights were bright, no one realized that it was Wen Yuan. Yi Mulin sat in the corner. He was very low-key and no one recognized him. He listened to Wen Yuan's music and felt a little pity for her. He had heard Miss Lin play on a certain occasion before. He thought that Wen Yuan was better than Lin Shui. It was a pity that Wen Yuan didn't become a musician. Yi Mulin listened quietly. Today he was listening to Wen Yuan play the guqin, not Lin Shui. Of course, Wen Yuan's performance also satisfied the audience. After every song was played, he would receive warm applause. Everyone felt that Lin Shui's performance tonight was much better than usual. Other than one person who was unhappy, it was Lin Shui backstage. She wasn't a fool, so of course she could hear it. But she was too proud to say it. She just asked her agent where he had found a substitute. Her manager said that he was a music teacher at a certain university and would never tell anyone about it. Only then did her expression soften a little. Then she looked at the tall man beside her. Mubai, if I had a choice I wouldn't be like this. The man she was talking to, Yi Mubai, was the biggest director in Hollywood today. He was the man that all the female stars in the industry wanted to get to know, and she was very lucky to get the favor of this man. He said that her profile when she played the piano was very beautiful. Yi Mubai held a bottle of red wine in his hand and looked displeased. You could have postponed your hand injury. You shouldn't have looked for a substitute. Why didn't you discuss this with me? Lin Shui was stunned for a moment. She dug her nails into the back of her hand and said in a wronged voice, because you only have 3 days. I want to play it for you. Chapter 3605. He held his wine glass and stood at the edge of the backstage. From this direction he could see the woman's side profile very clearly. It was so familiar that it made his heart throb as if he had seen it somewhere before. He looked at Lin Shui again and felt that it was indeed somewhat similar. Otherwise he wouldn't have been able to pass it off as a fisheye. He pointed it out. If she were to mix around in the music industry, your position might be threatened. Lin Shui was already very uncomfortable in her heart, and now her smile became even more forced. Are you saying that I'm not as good as a female teacher? Yi Mubai ignored her and tilted his ear. Listen, there's something in her zither that you don't have. It's soft and delicate, but it's also tough like an extremely thin steel wire. Lin Shui walked over and looked at Wen Yuan with him. She always wanted to please Yi Mubai, because not only did she become a celebrity in the music industry, she also wanted to enter the big screen. She needed Yi Mubai's resources. Moreover, she liked him. He exuded a mysterious aura. He was really a very charming man. He wanted him. Just as she was about to say something, the concert ended. According to the procedure, Wen Yuan went to the backstage and replaced her on stage. When Wen Yuan walked in against the light and entered the backstage, her gaze froze. She looked straight at Yi Mubai and Lin Shui's fingers on his arm. It was obvious that their relationship was very close. Yi Mubai was not dead and he still had a woman. Wen Yuan just stood there, standing there, her gaze entangled with his. She didn't even move, just looking at him, looking at the man she had once loved so much, the man she had been in so much pain. She liked him and looked up to him for many years. She had also approached him and touched his skin. She knew him even if he turned into ashes. At this moment he was standing in front of her. It was him, but it wasn't him. Wen Yuan stared at him blankly, unwilling to look away. She softly called out his name, Mubai. Her voice was soft and trembling. Yi Mubai stared at her and said in a low voice, "You know me?" At this time, Lin Shui's expression did not look good. "Xiao Mei, take this lady out." He was a famous musician. She couldn't let this strange woman steal her limelight or Mubai's. Absolutely not. Xiao Mei was Lin Shui's agent. Although she felt that it was inappropriate, she still squeezed out a smile and said, "Miss Wen, your mission has been completed. Here's your check." As he spoke, he stuffed the check into Wen Yuan's hand and said in a low voice, "Miss Lin has a bad temper. Please bear with her, you know." However, Wen Yuan didn't even look at the check. She was still staring at Yi Mubai. She said softly, "Mubai, don't you recognize me? I'm Wen Yuan." Yi Mubai just stared at her. The expression on his face was very cold, very cold. In the past, Yi Mubai wasn't like this. He was a very warm man. Wen Yuan stared blankly at him. At this time Lin Shui became impatient. He picked up the check and threw it at Wen Yuan. "I told you that you can leave after taking the check. Miss Wen, what are you trying to do?" Don't tell me that you think you can replace me by playing a game? She looked at Xiaomei. Call security. Then she held Yimubai's hand and said softly, accompany me up. We agreed that you can't go back on your word. Chapter 3606. When Yuan stood there and she could only hear waves of applause. Her entire body lost its strength, her mind was blank and there was only one thought in her mind. He's alive, he's back. It doesn't matter, the woman beside him isn't a problem because she's Wen Yuan. At the front desk, when Lin Shui held onto Yimubai's arm and went on stage, Yi Mulan was also shocked. He looked at Yimubai and in his shock he thought of Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan must have seen them just now. Lin Shui gracefully bowed down and introduced Yimubai intimately. The fans below the stage screamed. Lin Shui smiled happily. She felt that Yimubai's willingness to attend proved her position in his heart. So when she walked backstage again and again she invited him, Mubai, we can celebrate tonight. The corner of Yimubai's mouth curled up into a mocking smile. Celebrate that you didn't expose yourself? She was a little unhappy. She felt that he was too straightforward, but in fact she liked his arrogance. Otherwise, with so many beauties abroad, if he was a little casual, how could she have a chance? She raised her head and looked at Yimubai. Her voice was gentle. Mubai, let's have a meal later. I'll live alone. This hint was obvious. Adults knew it. Actually, they had been dating for almost half a year, but he had never touched her. Lin Shui was wondering what he was waiting for. He was already a man in his 30s, didn't he need it? She didn't believe that such a charming man like his hormones wouldn't be able to do it. Besides, he could endure it. She was a normal woman and she couldn't help it either. As she said this, Yimubai seemed to think for a moment, but in the end he still nodded. All right. Lin Shui smiled, but the smile disappeared after a while. She looked at Wen Yuan and frowned. Why are you still here? Especially when Wen Yuan was wearing the same dress as her, and she was a good-looking woman with a good temperament, she was an eyesore. Wen Yuan walked closer and looked up at Yimubai. You're my man. You know me? Yimubai seemed to be looking at her. Wen Yuan's voice was choked with emotion. Yes, we've known each other for a long time, many years. Then she stretched out her hand. In her palm was a check of 2 million yuan. She looked at Lin Shui and said softly, I don't want the check anymore. Lin Shui sneered. You don't want the check, do you want my man? Miss Wen, is there something wrong with you? Is there something wrong with you? Or did you come here just to steal Mubai? Aren't you thinking too much? I see scheming women like you every day. Please leave. Take the check and leave immediately. With that, she threw the check at Wen Yuan's face in a humiliating manner. Yimubai frowned. Shui, you've gone too far. Although it was a reprimand, there was a hint of doting in it. Lin Shui immediately restrained herself and squeezed out a smile. Mubai, I just don't like people using me to get close to you. She's just an irrelevant woman. Yimubai's voice was indifferent. But just as he finished speaking, a man's voice rang in his ears. The voice was low, but it was especially pleasant to listen to. Mubai, Wen Yuan is not an irrelevant woman. She's your sister-in-law. With that, the person who walked out from the corner was Yi Mulan. Everyone was stunned. Wen Yuan was, Yimubai was, and Lin Shui was. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.